The hook. Forget everything you think you know about ancient Egypt. The true, baffling secret of the Nile is that the very civilization you learned about in school, the one with the sphinxes and the towering stone monuments, was once conquered and ruled by a people whose pyramids you've never seen. A people from the mysterious south, darker-skinned, and far more numerous in their royal tombs. This is the story of Sudan, the land of Kush, the true heart of Africa's forgotten majesty, and an epic that spirals from a golden age of black pharaohs to a modern tragedy of fractured identity. Introduction. The deep past, a cradle of civilization before the pyramids. The history of the territory we now call Sudan, or more accurately, the history of Nubia, is not a footnote to Egypt's glory. It is a foundation upon which much of that glory was built. This land is one of the deepest cradles of human civilization, a region where the very ideas of sedentary life, large-scale social organization, and monumental architecture first took root in Africa. The dawn on the Nile, from hunters to herders. Long before the pharaohs of Egypt raised their first mastaba, the peoples of the central Nile Valley were pioneers. Evidence from sites like the early Mesolithic settlements near Khartoum suggests a sophisticated culture that by the 8th millennium BC had moved beyond mere hunting and gathering. These early Sudanese ancestors were settling in fortified mud brick villages, managing cattle, and utilizing the seasonal rhythms of the Great River. This was not the stark desert landscape of today. The Sahara was greener, and the Nile Valley was a lifeline supporting an explosion of early African culture. By the 5th millennium BC, a vibrant Neolithic culture was flourishing in Upper Nubia, modern-day northern Sudan. This was the A-group culture, a sophisticated trading partner with pre-dynastic Egypt. They cultivated grain, bred livestock, and developed distinctive pottery that showcased an artistic flair distinct from their northern neighbors. For centuries, this region and Egypt were two distinct yet interconnected spheres of influence, often competing but always sharing the fundamental gift of the Nile. The Kingdom of Kerma, Africa's first great empire, c. 2500 to 1500 BC. Our story truly begins to bloom with the emergence of the Kingdom of Kerma around 2500 BC. This was the first fully articulated, centralized state south of Egypt, and it was a formidable power. Kerma's capital, also called Kerma, was a sprawling city with a complex administration, monumental religious structures known as defufas, massive mud brick temples unlike anything found in Egypt, and a vast royal cemetery that speaks of incredible wealth and social hierarchy. The largest defufa was a colossal three-story structure that served as the kingdom's spiritual and political heart, dominating the landscape. The Golden Age of Kush. Kerma was not a backwater. It controlled the trade routes that funneled gold, ivory, exotic animal skins, and precious incense from the African interior northwards. This wealth fueled an empire that, during its height, the Middle Kerma period, was powerful enough to threaten Egypt itself. Archaeological discoveries reveal an advanced, powerful, and distinctly African culture, a forgotten empire of incredible prestige. The surprising truth is that for a time, Kerma was more stable and wealthier than a fractured Egypt, but the tide turned. Around 1500 BC, the expansionist New Kingdom of Egypt, under pharaohs like Thutmose I and Thutmose III, marched south. Kerma fell, and Nubia entered a period of Egyptian occupation, becoming a colonial outpost called Kush. 2. The triumphant reversal, the age of the Black Pharaohs, the 25th dynasty. The Egyptian occupation, lasting for nearly 500 years, was a transformative period. Egyptian gods, language, and administration were adopted, but this was a two-way cultural exchange. The Nubians, or Kushites, absorbed the trappings of Egyptian civilization, but never surrendered their underlying African identity or their political ambition. The rise of Napata. As Egypt fell into political disarray and weakness in the Third Intermediate Period, the Kushite elite, who had served in the Egyptian administration and military, seized their moment. They established a new, fully independent kingdom with its capital at Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. This was the true, magnificent rebirth of the kingdom of Kush. In Napata, a line of powerful, pious, and intensely proud kings began to rule. They considered themselves the last true custodians of Egyptian civilization, appalled by the corruption and internal divisions of the northern rulers. Their destiny, they believed, was to restore order to the Nile Valley, to conquer Egypt and unite the two lands once more. Pa, the conqueror of the Nile, c. 744 to 714 BC. The central, astonishing figure of this period is King Pa. Pa was a black pharaoh, a Nubian king who accomplished what no native Egyptian ruler of his time could. He conquered and unified all of Egypt. Pa's campaign, around 730 BC, is one of the most remarkable and well-documented military expeditions of the ancient world. His own inscription, the famous Victory Stela, tells a dramatic first-person tale of his righteous crusade. I am the son of the gods, the image of Amun. Know that I am the one who created the two lands, and I am the one who guides the Great One who is in the land of the blacks. Pa marched north, not merely as a conqueror, but as a religious reformer. He forced his soldiers to undergo ritual purification before battle, and berated his Egyptian rivals for their impiety. He defeated all the petty local kings, received their surrender, and then returned to Napata, content with having restored Egyptian religious and political order. Pa and his successors, most famously his brother Shabaka and his son Tarhaka, ruled over the largest Egyptian empire since the New Kingdom, controlling territory from modern-day Khartoum all the way to the Mediterranean. They built temples, restored monuments, and were buried in the first of the famous Nubian pyramids, a phenomenon that will shock most U.S. audiences. Sudan is home to more pyramids, over 200, than Egypt, about 120. The Nubian pyramids are steeper and generally smaller than the Giza monuments, but they are architecturally unique and tell a story of a civilization that adapted a foreign concept, the pyramid, to its own intensely powerful burial customs. The Assyrian pushback and the retreat to Meroe. The reign of the Black Pharaohs ended not in civil war, but in a clash with a global superpower, the Assyrian Empire from Mesopotamia. King Tarhaka, perhaps the most famous of the Nubian rulers, engaged in a decades-long struggle to protect his Egyptian territories. The Assyrians, with their superior iron weapons and ruthless military machine, eventually pushed the Kushite kings back. By 663 BC, the last Nubian pharaoh, Tanwetamani, was forced to retreat south. The Kushites never recaptured the north, but their empire did not end. It simply shifted its focus, moving the capital further south, away from Egyptian and Mediterranean influence, to the mysterious city of Meroe. The Meroite Empire, Africa's independent heartland, c. 591 BC to 350 AD. The shift of the capital to Meroe marks the most fascinating and perhaps most independent chapter of ancient Sudanese history. The Meroite Kingdom, or Meroe, was the bridge that fully connected the pharaonic Nile Valley with the deep indigenous cultures of sub-Saharan Africa. A distinctive African culture. Meroe was geographically isolated, thriving on its control of the trade routes that stretched deep into the African interior and east towards the Red Sea. This separation allowed Kush to shed its heaviest Egyptian influences and develop a powerful, unique cultural identity. Language. The Meroite script, a unique alphabetic system, emerged to write the indigenous Meroite language. To this day, the language remains a puzzle, only partially deciphered, yet its inscriptions mark an independent literary tradition in Africa. Technology. Meroe became an important early center for iron smelting in Africa. The huge slag heaps found at the site testify to a thriving iron industry, giving the Meroite armies a technological edge and supplying trade goods across the continent. Meroe was the Birmingham of Africa in the ancient world. Architecture. The Meroite style of art and architecture blended Egyptian, Hellenistic, and indigenous African elements.
The magnificent royal city of Meroe, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is littered with incredible pyramids, temples, and palaces that attest to a glorious forgotten civilization. The reign of the Kandakis, warrior queens. One of the astonishing facts about Meroite history, and a detail that resonates deeply with modern U.S. audiences, is the prominence of female rulers known as Kandakis, or Candaces. These were powerful, independent queens, often depicted as formidable warrior leaders.
The most famous of these is Kandake Amanirenas, who led the Kushite armies in a major war against the might of the Roman Empire around 25 BC. When Roman forces under Emperor Augustus invaded parts of Kushite territory, Amanirenas responded with a fierce counterattack. She successfully managed to raid the Roman garrison at Aswan, a shocking humiliation that forced the Romans into a defensive stance. The subsequent peace treaty with Augustus was highly favorable to Meroe, securing Kushite borders and ending Roman encroachment. The image of a one-eyed, powerful black queen challenging the full might of Rome is a historical reality that utterly overturns common perceptions of African antiquity. Meroe's decline and fall. Meroe endured for nearly 1,000 years after the retreat from Egypt, a testament to its strategic depth and cultural resilience. Its eventual decline remains an archaeological and historical debate. Factors likely included the decline of the overland trade routes, the rise of the competing kingdom of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia, and climate change affecting the Nile's flow and agricultural output. Around 350 AD, the Meroic Empire fell, possibly to an invasion from the Aksumite king Ezana. This marked the end of the last great indigenous pharaonic tradition in the Nile Valley.
Crucially, the British administration adopted a policy of Southern policy in the 1920s and 30s. This policy was based on the premise that the northern, predominantly Arab and Muslim population, and the southern, predominantly African, Christian, and animist population were fundamentally distinct and should be administered separately. North developed relatively more, with investment in infrastructure, education, like Gordon Memorial College, now the University of Khartoum, and irrigation for cotton. Arabic and Islamic law were dominant. South, isolated from the North. English was promoted over Arabic. Christian missionary schools were encouraged over Islamic education, and development was intentionally minimal. The aim was to eventually join the South with British East Africa. This policy effectively solidified the cultural and administrative barrier between North and South, ensuring that as independence approached, the two halves of the country were ill-prepared to coexist within a unified state. The roots of the later civil wars were deliberately and systematically sown in the fertile political ground of the condominium. The road to independence. After World War II, the rise of Egyptian nationalism and the anti-colonial sentiment in Sudan forced Britain's hand. In a disastrous move known as the Juba Conference of 1947, the British reversed the Southern policy, deciding that North and South must be administered as a single entity without consulting the Southern leaders. This sudden, forced unity, without any constitutional protections for the South, was seen by many in the South as a betrayal, a handing over of their future to a northern elite they distrusted. Sudan achieved independence on January 1, 1956. It was the largest country in Africa, a mosaic of peoples, united only by a shared, traumatic history of colonialism and exploitation. Yet before the flag of the new republic was even fully raised, the seeds of civil war had already begun to sprout in the neglected, marginalized South. The Age of Civil War and Division, 1956 to 2011. The story of independent Sudan is a profound tragedy, an endless cycle of civil conflict, military coups, and humanitarian catastrophe that continues to this day. The fundamental failure was the inability of the central, Khartoum-based government to manage the immense diversity and historical inequalities inherited from the colonial era. The First Sudanese Civil War, 1955 to 1972. The First Civil War began even before independence was officially declared. Led by Southern soldiers and politicians who feared Northern domination and the imposition of a unified Arab-Islamic identity. This conflict pitted the central government against the Southern movement known as the Ananya. This war, driven by a struggle for resources, culture, religion, and political power, was devastating, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths and displacing countless others. The war finally ended with the Addis Ababa Agreement of 1972, which granted the South a degree of autonomy. This period of peace, however, was a fleeting moment of hope. The Second Sudanese Civil War, 1983 to 2005. The fragile peace shattered in 1983 when the then-president Jafar Nimiri unilaterally declared the imposition of strict Sharia law across the entire country, including the non-Muslim South, and dissolved the South's autonomous government. This was the spark that ignited the Second Sudanese Civil War, a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. The Southern resistance coalesced under the banner of the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA, led by figures like John Garang de Mabior. This conflict was not just a war over autonomy, it was a war over the very identity of Sudan. Was it to be a unified, secular state that respected its diversity, the SPLA's position, or a unified Arab-Islamic state, the Khartoum government's position? Humanitarian crisis. The war lasted for 22 years, killing an estimated 2 million people and internally displacing over 4 million. The brutalization of the civilian population, the use of famine as a weapon of war, and the systematic destruction of entire communities made it one of the deadliest conflicts of the late 20th century. The Lost Boys of Sudan. This period saw the tragic flight of over 20,000 Dinka and Nuer boys who were separated from their families and walked thousands of miles to refugee camps in Ethiopia and Kenya, a story that captured the attention of the U.S. public and became a symbol of the war's horror. The Darfur Genocide, 2003 to present. Even as the Second Civil War ground to a halt, a new horrific conflict erupted in the western region of Darfur. Driven by decades of marginalization, resource scarcity, and political neglect, local non-Arab rebel groups rose up against the Khartoum government, then led by Omar al-Bashir. Al-Bashir's government responded with overwhelming force, mobilizing the notorious Arab militias known as the Janjaweed, or Devils on Horseback. This counterinsurgency quickly devolved into a campaign of ethnic cleansing and systematic violence against the non-Arab Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa groups. In 2004, the U.S. government, under Secretary of State Colin Powell, officially declared the violence in Darfur a genocide, marking the first time the U.S. had done so while the atrocity was still ongoing. The conflict killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions, creating a humanitarian crisis that stretched across the border into Chad. The International Criminal Court, ICC, later issued an arrest warrant for President al-Bashir for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The fragmentation and the unfinished story. The cumulative toll of decades of war and suffering finally led to a momentous, irreversible decision. The birth of South Sudan. International pressure, mediated by the U.S., the U.K., and others, led to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, CPA, of 2005, which ended the Second Sudanese Civil War. The key provision of the CPA was a referendum on southern independence after a 6-year interim period. In January 2011, the referendum was held, and the results were an overwhelming 98% in favor of secession. On July 9, 2011, South Sudan was declared an independent nation, ending the cycle of civil war by officially splitting the largest country in Africa into two.
The unending instability. The separation, however, did not bring lasting peace to either nation. South Sudan immediately plunged into its own internal conflicts, largely driven by ethnic and political rivalries between its leaders, resulting in a devastating civil war just 2 years after independence. Sudan North struggled with a collapsing economy, ongoing conflict in marginalized areas like Darfur, Blue Nile, and South Kordofan, and the continued rule of Omar al-Bashir. The story came to another head in 2019, when a massive, months-long, non-violent popular uprising led to the overthrow of the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. This sparked a fragile transition to democracy, led by a civilian-military partnership. That transition, full of promise, was brutally ended in April 2023, when the two dominant military factions, the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, which evolved from the Janjaweed militias, turned on each other in a devastating war for control of the country. This conflict has reduced the capital, Khartoum, to ruins, driven millions into internal and external displacement, and tragically reignited the horrific ethnically targeted violence in Darfur and elsewhere. The enduring legacy. The land of Sudan is not a single narrative, but an epic palimpsest, a canvas rewritten over millennia, but with the older, deeper text still visible beneath. It is the land of the black pharaohs who conquered Egypt, of the warrior queens who defied Rome, of the Mahdi who threw off the chains of empire, and of a modern people struggling against the weight of a history that refuses to let them find peace. It is a story of magnificent ancient wealth, deep-seated cultural diversity, and an ongoing, heartbreaking struggle for a just, stable, and unified identity. The astonishing truth of Sudan is that its history is one of the most powerful, continuous, and globally significant chronicles in the world, yet it remains one of the most tragically overlooked. Its past is a testament to African greatness. Its present is a stark reminder of the cost of fragmentation and unhealed historical wounds.